All right, let me start my reflection on the link between memory and democracy by relating to a phenomenon that we see in recent politics, which is once societies move away from authoritarian rule to democracy, issues of collective memory, the past of the country, take center stage. And in those periods of transition, fundamental questions about the legacy, the past of those countries come to the fore. What has allowed authoritarian rule to be in place for such a long time? What has prevented change? And in this respect, it's not too surprising to see that we have institutions such as international courts or truth and reconciliation commissions taking shape and taking an important role in a way allowing this transition to happen successfully. This is a period in which victims of those regimes get a voice, in which all those difficult issues about past injustices come to the fore. And if you think empirically, you can go back to post-war Germany, where the Nuremberg trial as an international court played a critical role of giving a stage to having and paying tribute and having knowledge about those past injustices. And arguably, democracy in Western Germany over the decades after the war deepened once there was a greater willingness to address issues of past injustices, the horrific events of the Nazi crimes and the Holocaust more deeply. At the same time, we also have truth and reconciliation commissions more recently in countries such as South Africa, Chile, and in recent years in Colombia. And they all point to the fact of how important dealing with and addressing past injustices is in allowing this transition to happen. Now let me conceptually think about the link between memory and democracy with respect to three arguments, how they are linked. The first one is to state that in order for societies to move towards democracy, to become inclusive, they need to provide voice to the victims of those regimes. Because if you think about it, democracies, they need to, in a way, address past injustices also to overcome the friction that was caused by authoritarian regimes. They need to heal, and in this respect, they need to overcome the trauma that is associated with dictatorial authoritarian rule. And this is what we see most vividly once we create this space, that victims gain a voice, that victims have an ability to, in a way, relate the injustices that they have encountered. And this is, from a fundamental perspective, healing and the only possible way forward to achieving reconciliation, the truth about the past. And if you think about what's happening currently in Canada, you could make the argument that we undergo a critical transformation of Canadian democracy, not from dictatorial regime to democracy, but a deepening of democracy in terms of recognizing the injustices related to the country's colonial past, its treatment of indigenous peoples. So that was the first one, giving voice to victims and addressing past injustices. The second one is to create, based on a collective memory, create a new narrative of what the political community stands for, what kind of values it represents. And this is the critical part about memory politics. What does it mean? Let's not forget. Never again. These commitments to learning from the past. And what we see is that democracies are critically dependent on addressing those developments, those shared experiences in the past that prevented them from being able to sustain themselves as they failed or not living up to the expectations. So what we see here is that memory provides a narrative for a political community, a fundamental way to describe what values and practices the community endorses. And you can't do this without the past. You need to learn from the past to say, that's where we not want to go again, and what do we need to do to supersede the often quite painful past. And the last point is to think about how memory and democracy are directly linked through storytelling. Who is the agent of addressing the past. And if you look at what happens in authoritarian regimes, it's normally a collective memory that is prescribed from above. It is there to justify the political status quo. It is there to exclude particular group. It is there to justify a regime that doesn't allow for democratic participation. What happens in democratic societies is that grassroots actors, civil society actors, take it upon themselves to contest history, to tell their story about past events. And with this, we have a far greater discursive freedom to address what happened in the past and what we learned from it. So opening up a space to multiplicity of actors, to civil societies actively engaged in addressing the past, is, in my view, constitutive for mature democracies. So not the state, the authorities defining what happened in the past and providing an often heroic narrative, but rather grassroots actors contesting the dominant narratives and telling their own stories. So these are the three conceptual ways in which, in my view, memory and democracy are related. In the contemporary political environment, what we see is a resurgence of populism and nationalism from the right, a new claim for power coming from the authoritarian right. And what we see here is a systematic use of particular historical narrative to justify their power, their quest for rule. And I think in this respect, at the moment, we go through a critical, renewed struggle about what constitutes our democracies, what narratives and norms and practices we can rely on. In this respect, I think what we see is also a fight over a legitimate form of interpreting the past and what we learn from it. The horrors of the 20th century seem to be found in the past. Fascism, authoritarianism, genocide, at least from the European Western perspective. But I think what we've learned over the past couple of years is how fragile, in a way, democracy and inclusiveness is as a norm and practice. And narratives of the past will help us to understand what it takes to defend them, but also how vulnerable they are.